From a Great Dane in fake ears to Rex Harrison singing lullabies in brownface, this 1954 Warner Brothers epic holds secrets stranger than any medieval legend. Filming stopped in Arizona's scorching heat. The director was a Shirley Temple specialist, and the movie earned a spot on the Worst Films Ever list despite groundbreaking technology. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about King Richard and the Crusaders. Fact 1. The dog wore prosthetic ears. When you watch King Richard and the Crusaders, you might notice the loyal wolfhound that accompanies the Scottish knight Sir Kenneth throughout his adventures in the Holy Land. What you probably won't notice is that the dog's ears aren't real. According to production notes from January 1954, the Great Dane cast to play Roswal, Kenneth's faithful companion, wore specially made false ears for every single scene in which he appeared. This wasn't just a random production quirk, but rather a deliberate choice made by the Warner Brothers costume and animal departments to achieve a specific look that matched their vision of what a medieval wolfhound should look like on screen. The decision to give the dog prosthetic ears came from the studio's desire for historical authenticity, or at least their 1950s Hollywood version of it. While the filmmakers were willing to take all sorts of liberties with historical accuracy in the script and costumes for the human actors, they apparently drew the line at using a Great Dane with its natural floppy ears to portray a wolfhound. The production team believed that modifying the dog's appearance would help audiences better accept the animal as an authentic medieval hunting hound, even though most viewers watching the film in theaters would have had no idea what an actual 12th century wolfhound looked like anyway. The false ears were carefully attached before each day of filming and were designed to stand more upright and pointed than the Great Dane's natural ear shape. This unusual attention to canine costuming shows just how far the studio was willing to go in their quest for a certain kind of visual authenticity, even if other aspects of the film took considerable creative liberties with Sir Walter Scott's original story and actual historical events from the Third Crusade. Fact 2. Filming stopped at 10:30 a.m. daily. The production of King Richard and the Crusaders required 2 weeks of location shooting in Yuma, Arizona, where the desert landscape was meant to stand in for the sun-baked plains of the Holy Land during the Third Crusade. However, the Arizona desert proved to be almost too authentic for the cast and crew to handle. Director David Butler later recalled that the temperatures in Yuma became so unbearably hot during the daytime hours that the production team had to establish a very unusual filming schedule just to keep everyone safe and functional. Every single day during those 2 weeks of location work, Butler was forced to call a halt to all filming activities at exactly 10:30 in the morning because the heat had climbed to dangerous levels that made it impossible for actors in heavy medieval costumes and armor to continue working. The production would then shut down completely for the middle portion of the day, with cast and crew retreating to whatever shade and cooling they could find while they waited for the worst of the desert heat to pass. Filming wouldn't resume again until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when the temperatures finally dropped enough to make outdoor work tolerable once more. This meant that the crew lost more than 4 hours of potential filming time every single day, which must have put considerable pressure on the production schedule and budget. Butler described the experience years later, noting that despite these challenging conditions and the compressed filming windows, the cast maintained what he called great camaraderie throughout the location shoot. The extreme heat of Yuma was just one of many unusual challenges that plagued this troubled production, though the cast and crew managed to push through and complete all the necessary desert scenes despite Mother Nature's attempts to shut them down. Fact 3. A Shirley Temple director helmed this epic. One of the most puzzling decisions Warner Brothers made during the production of King Richard and the Crusaders was their choice of director for this large-scale medieval adventure film. The studio assigned David Butler to helm the project, which seemed like an odd fit, given that Butler had built his entire reputation directing light-hearted musical comedies and family-friendly entertainment, most notably several films starring child actress Shirley Temple during the 1930s. Butler's background was about as far removed from epic sword and sandal adventures as you could get in Hollywood, and both critics and audiences Notice this mismatch between director and material when the film was released in 1954. What made this choice even more baffling to industry observers was that Warner Brothers had Michael Curtiz under contract and working on their lot at the exact same time. Curtiz was the studio's go-to director for action-packed adventure films and had already proven his mastery of the genre with swashbucklers like Captain Blood and The Adventures of Robin Hood, both of which featured elaborate sword fights, period costumes, and exactly the kind of large-scale action sequences that King Richard and the Crusaders required. Film critics and historians have spent decades trying to understand why the studio would pass over someone with Curtiz's proven track record in favor of Butler, whose strengths lay in creating charming musical numbers and managing child performers, rather than staging medieval battle scenes and jousting tournaments. Butler himself seemed to have enjoyed making the film and spoke positively about the experience in later interviews. But the final product clearly showed the limitations of having a director more comfortable with tap dancing routines than with coordinating cavalry charges in siege warfare, which contributed significantly to the film's troubled reputation among critics and audiences alike. Fact 4. Warner Brothers' first CinemaScope film, King Richard and the Crusaders, holds a special place in Warner Brothers history as the studio's very first film shot in the CinemaScope format, which represented a significant technical achievement and marked the beginning of a new era for the company. CinemaScope was a revolutionary widescreen filming process that had only been introduced to Hollywood a couple of years earlier. And by 1954, it was still considered cutting-edge technology that most studios were just beginning to experiment with and implement into their production schedules. The format used special anamorphic lenses to capture a much wider field of view than traditional filming methods, creating an image that was more than twice as wide as it was tall when projected on theater screens. Warner Brothers made the strategic decision to use this medieval adventure as their test case for entering the widescreen era, betting that the sweeping desert landscapes, elaborate battle sequences, and grand castle sets would benefit from the expanded visual canvas that CinemaScope provided. The format was particularly well-suited to showcasing the kinds of spectacle that King Richard and the Crusaders aimed to deliver, including wide shots of cavalry charges, jousting tournaments, and the vast encampments of the Crusader armies stretched across the plains of the Holy Land. The studio invested heavily in the new camera equipment and projection systems needed to film and display CinemaScope presentations, understanding that this technology represented the future of theatrical exhibition as Hollywood worked to compete with the growing popularity of television by offering audiences visual experiences they simply couldn't get on their small home screens. The gamble on this new format was part of Warner Brothers' larger strategy to prove they could produce the same kind of epic entertainment that rival studios like MGM had been creating with films like Ivanhoe and Knights of the Round Table. Fact 5. The premiere featured revolutionary projection technology. The Hollywood premiere of King Richard and the Crusaders on July 8, 1954, at the famous Egyptian Theater became notable for reasons that went beyond just celebrating the film itself. This screening marked the very first public use of a groundbreaking projection aperture system that Warner Brothers had developed specifically to solve one of the biggest technical challenges facing movie theaters at the time. The studio's engineers had created an innovative apparatus that could adapt the film's projection to fit any screen size, which was a major breakthrough in an era when theaters across the country had screens of wildly different dimensions and proportions depending on when they were built and how much money their owners had available for upgrades. What made this system truly revolutionary was its flexibility in handling films of different gauges, meaning that a single theater equipped with this Warner Brothers aperture could show movies shot on various types of film stock without needing multiple projection systems or expensive modifications to their existing equipment. This was particularly important in 1954 because the film industry was in the midst of a confusing transition period where different studios were experimenting with competing widescreen formats, and theater owners were understandably reluctant to invest in expensive new projection equipment that might become obsolete within a year or two. The premiere event itself was treated as a major technological showcase, with the festivities being simultaneously broadcast on both KABC television and radio so that audiences at home could participate in this historic moment for cinema technology. Warner Brothers clearly understood that they were introducing something significant to the industry, and they wanted to make sure that both Hollywood insiders and the general public recognized the importance of this innovation, even if the film itself didn't quite live up to the studio's hopes for critical and commercial success. Fact 6. Rex Harrison called it an absolutely rotten picture. Rex Harrison, who played the role of Saladin in King Richard and the Crusaders, became one of the film's harshest critics despite delivering what many viewers considered to be one of the better performances in the entire production. In interviews conducted years after the film's release, Harrison didn't hold back his true feelings about the project, bluntly describing it as an absolutely rotten picture without any attempt to soften his assessment or spare the feelings of his former collaborators. This kind of brutal honesty from a leading actor about their own work was relatively unusual in Hollywood at the time, where stars typically tried to say something diplomatic about even their worst films out of professional courtesy or concern for their reputations. What makes Harrison's harsh judgment even more interesting is that he immediately followed up his criticism with an admission that he had actually enjoyed certain aspects of making the movie, particularly the physical demands of the role. He confessed that King Richard and the Crusaders was the first horsey picture I'd played in, and I was fascinated by all the writing and action sequences that the production required. Harrison, who was better known for sophisticated drawing room comedies and theatrical roles that relied on his wit and charm rather than physical prowess, found himself genuinely intrigued by the challenge of learning to handle horses and participate in the kind of swashbuckling action scenes he had never attempted before in his career. This contradiction between his overall negative view of the finished film and his personal enjoyment of the filming experience reveals the complex feelings that actors sometimes have about their work, where they can simultaneously recognize that a project failed artistically while still treasuring the new skills and experiences they gained during production. Fact 7. Lawrence Harvey's copper-colored armor mystery. One of the most visually striking and unusual choices in King Richard and the Crusaders was the distinctive armor worn by Lawrence Harvey's character, Sir Kenneth of Scotland, throughout the entire film. Unlike the typical silver, gold, or black finishes that audiences had come to expect from knights and warriors in Hollywood medieval epics, Harvey's armor featured a deep copper color that immediately caught the attention of viewers when the film was released. This rich reddish-brown metallic finish was so unusual that many audience members who saw the film in theaters during its original run specifically commented on it in reviews and letters, noting that they had never seen anything quite like it in any previous sword and sandal adventure movie. The copper-colored armor became such a memorable visual element that film enthusiasts spent years trying to recall if they had ever encountered similar costume choices in other productions. And the only comparable example anyone could remember was the armor and shields worn by the Philistine warriors in Cecil B. DeMille's Samson and Delilah from 1949, which also featured copper-toned metallic costumes. The reasons behind the decision to give Sir Kenneth this distinctive copper armor have never been fully explained by the production team or costume designers, leaving film historians to speculate about whether it was meant to signify something specific about his Scottish heritage, set him apart visually from the other Crusader knights, or simply provide an eye-catching contrast against the predominantly silver armor worn by most of the other characters. Whatever the intention, the unusual choice succeeded in making Harvey's character instantly recognizable in every scene, though it also contributed to the film's reputation for taking creative liberties with historical accuracy in favor of theatrical visual impact. Fact 8. Named one of the 50 worst films ever, King Richard and the Crusaders achieved a particularly dubious form of cinematic immortality when it was selected for inclusion in Harry Medved's 1978 book titled The 50 Worst Films of All Time and How They Got That Way, which became an influential and widely read guide to Hollywood's most notable failures. Medved's book was remarkable for being written by a teenager and helped launch an entire genre of entertainment focused on celebrating and analyzing bad movies, making it a significant cultural phenomenon that introduced many readers to the concept of finding enjoyment in cinematic disasters. The Book didn't just focus on cheap B-movies or forgotten obscurities, but instead deliberately included big-budget studio productions with recognizable stars to make its points more controversial and interesting to readers. When Medved discussed King Richard and the Crusaders in his book, he specifically highlighted Virginia Mayo's dialogue as prime evidence of the film's overall poor quality, pointing to her line about Dick Plantagenet as an example of the kind of painfully awkward writing that plagued the entire production. The inclusion of this film in such a prominent list of terrible movies had a lasting impact on its reputation, cementing its status as a well-known example of Hollywood excess and misguided ambition rather than allowing it to fade into obscurity as many mediocre films do. What makes this designation particularly interesting is that many film historians and critics have argued over the years that King Richard and the Crusaders, while certainly flawed, isn't actually anywhere near as bad as its reputation suggests, and that there are countless films far more deserving of being called among the worst ever made. But Medved's book ensured that this particular medieval adventure would be remembered primarily for its failures rather than its modest entertainment value. Fact 9. The most infamous line in movie history. Of all the questionable dialogue choices in King Richard and the Crusaders, one line stands out above all others for its sheer awkwardness and has become perhaps the most frequently cited example of bad historical movie writing in film criticism. Virginia Mayo, playing Lady Edith Plantagenet, delivers the now infamous line, "War, war, that's all you ever think about, Dick Plantagenet," while speaking to King Richard during a dramatic moment in the film. What made this line so memorably terrible was the casual and overly familiar way it addressed the medieval English monarch, using his surname Plantagenet as if it were a modern nickname like calling someone by their last name at a casual social gathering. The problem with this dialogue is that nobody in the 12th century would have spoken to a king this way, and certainly wouldn't have used his family name as a chummy form of address that sounds more appropriate for a 1950s suburban housewife scolding her husband than a noblewoman speaking to the ruler of England during the Crusades. Film critics and historians have pointed to this single line for decades as a perfect encapsulation of everything wrong with Hollywood's approach to historical accuracy during this era, when screenwriters seemed more concerned with making dialogue sound snappy and modern than with creating any sense of authenticity about how people from different time periods actually spoke to one another. The line became so notorious that it was quoted extensively in books and articles about bad movies, and film students were taught to use it as an example of how not to write period dialogue. The casual Dick, combined with the surname used as a nickname, created an unintentionally comedic effect that completely undermined any dramatic tension the scene was supposed to generate. Fact 10. Knights Templar became Castellanes for mysterious reasons. One of the most peculiar changes that the filmmakers made when adapting Sir Walter Scott's novel, The Talisman, was the decision to completely rename the villainous military order that conspires against King Richard throughout the story. In Scott's original novel, these treacherous knights were clearly identified as members of the Knights Templar, the famous historical religious military order that played a major role in the Crusades. However, in the film version, this group was transformed into an entirely fictional organization called the Castellanes, sometimes referred to as Castlers, with no explanation given to audiences about why this change was deemed necessary. Film historians have debated the reasons behind this unusual alteration for decades, and two main theories have emerged to explain the decision. The first theory suggests that the change was mandated by the Hollywood Production Code, which was still strictly enforced in 1954 and included rules against negative portrayals of clergy or religious organizations in films. Since the Knights Templar were technically a monastic order whose members took religious vows, depicting them as villains and traitors might have violated these censorship guidelines and caused problems with the code administrators who had to approve every major studio release. The second theory proposes that Warner Brothers was concerned about offending members of the Masonic Knights Templar, a fraternal organization that had adopted the name and some of the symbolism of the medieval order. This theory suggests that the studio knew that numerous powerful and influential figures in Hollywood were members of this Masonic group and feared that depicting Knights Templar as scheming villains might create enemies within the industry. So they invented a completely new name to avoid any potential controversy or backlash from these well-connected fraternal brothers. Fact 11. Rex Harrison sang love songs in brownface. Among the many strange creative choices made during the production of King Richard and the Crusaders, perhaps none has aged more poorly or generated more discussion among film historians than a particularly bizarre scene featuring Rex Harrison's portrayal of Saladin. Harrison played the legendary Muslim leader while wearing heavy dark makeup to darken his skin, which was an unfortunately common practice in Hollywood during the 1950s when studios routinely cast white actors in Middle Eastern or Asian roles rather than hiring performers from those backgrounds. However, what made Harrison's performance even more uncomfortable and memorable was a scene where his character actually sings romantic, lullaby-style songs to George Sanders, who plays the wounded King Richard as he recovers from an assassination attempt. The scene was apparently intended to show Saladin's cultured nature and his compassionate treatment of his worthy adversary, but the execution resulted in something that plays as unintentionally campy and awkward rather than touching or dignified. Film critics and historians have pointed to this musical interlude as one of the most peculiar moments in the entire movie, noting that having one leading man serenade another with love songs creates a tone that the filmmakers almost certainly did not intend. The scene has become notorious in discussions of the film precisely because it combines multiple elements that modern audiences find problematic, from the use of brownface makeup to the strange romantic undertones of the musical performance. Even viewers at the time found the sequence odd, with several contemporary reviews specifically mentioning Harrison's singing as one of the film's more bizarre creative decisions, though nobody in 1954 seemed to question the appropriateness of casting a British actor in dark makeup to play one of history's most famous Islamic leaders. Fact 12. Francois Truffaut's backhanded compliment. King Richard and the Crusaders received one of the most memorably mixed reviews in its entire critical reception from Francois Truffaut, who would later become one of the most celebrated and influential filmmakers of the French New Wave movement, but was working as a film critic when he wrote about this medieval adventure. Truffaut's assessment of the film was simultaneously harsh and oddly complimentary, creating a backhanded review that perfectly captured the strange appeal that big-budget Hollywood entertainment could have even when it was clearly poorly made. He used King Richard and the Crusaders as evidence to support his theory that American films possessed certain qualities that allowed them to succeed with audiences even when they were objectively bad, writing that the movie confirmed his belief that a bad American film goes over better than a bad French film with moviegoers. Truffaut didn't pull any punches when discussing the film's obvious weaknesses, openly criticizing what he called its childish scenario and simplistic dialogues that demonstrated little sophistication or intelligence in the writing. However, he then pivoted to acknowledge that despite these serious flaws, the film managed to maintain viewer engagement through pure momentum and professional craftsmanship, noting that the rhythm does not falter throughout its running time, and that audiences watching the movie would feel comfortable and entertained, even while consuming obviously second-rate material. This observation reflected Truffaut's complicated relationship with Hollywood cinema, where he could simultaneously recognize and critique the artistic shortcomings of American studio productions, while also appreciating their technical polish and understanding of how to keep audiences engaged through sheer forward momentum and visual spectacle, even when the underlying story and dialogue were deeply problematic. Fact 13. The premiere was delayed by John Wayne. Warner Brothers had carefully planned a grand Hollywood premiere for King Richard and the Crusaders at the prestigious Egyptian Theater, but their carefully orchestrated schedule hit an unexpected snag that forced them to postpone the entire event. The problem was that another film, John Wayne's aviation disaster drama The High and the Mighty, had become such an enormous box office success that the theater simply couldn't end its run to make room for the scheduled premiere of the medieval adventure. The Wayne film was selling so many tickets and drawing such large crowds that the theater management and distributors made the business decision to keep it playing for an extended period, which meant that King Richard and the Crusaders would have to wait its turn before it could have its moment in the spotlight at one of Hollywood's most famous venues. This delay must have been particularly frustrating for Warner Brothers executives who were counting on a splashy premiere to generate publicity and positive word of mouth for their expensive CinemaScope production, but the studio had no choice except to reschedule and hope that the momentum wouldn't be lost. When the premiere finally took place, Warner Brothers decided to make the event even more elaborate than originally planned to compensate for the delay and generate maximum attention for their film. The festivities were simultaneously broadcast on both KABC television and radio, allowing audiences throughout the Los Angeles area to participate in the glamorous Hollywood premiere from the comfort of their own homes. This dual broadcast approach was relatively innovative for 1954 and demonstrated how studios were beginning to embrace television as a promotional tool rather than viewing it purely as competition for theatrical releases. Fact 14. Legendary stuntman Yakima Canutt directed action sequences. While David Butler served as the main director of King Richard and the Crusaders, the film's most exciting and well-executed sequences were actually the responsibility of Yakima Canutt, who worked as the second unit director in charge of all the major action scenes. Canutt was already a legendary figure in Hollywood by 1954, having established himself as perhaps the greatest stuntman in the history of motion pictures through decades of groundbreaking work that revolutionized how action sequences were filmed. He had gained particular fame for creating the spectacular and dangerous horse-to-stagecoach transfer stunt in John Ford's 1939 Western Stagecoach, where he threw himself underneath a team of galloping horses in a sequence that is still considered one of the most impressive stunts ever captured on film. For King Richard and the Crusaders, Canutt was specifically brought in to choreograph and direct the elaborate jousting tournaments and mounted combat scenes that were essential to the film's medieval setting and adventure storyline. Even critics who found little to praise in the rest of the movie consistently singled out these action sequences as the film's strongest and most entertaining elements, noting that the jousting scenes in particular displayed a level of energy and professional craftsmanship that elevated them far above the quality of the surrounding material. Canutt's work on this production was part of an impressive career that would continue for many more years, and he would go on to achieve perhaps his greatest triumph just 5 years later when he was hired to stage the iconic chariot race sequence in the 1959 version of Ben-Hur, which earned him widespread recognition and helped secure his legacy as one of the most important behind-the-scenes contributors to Hollywood's golden age of epic adventure filmmaking. Fact 15. The title changed mid-production. When production on King Richard and the Crusaders began in January of 1954, the film was actually called The Talisman, which was the title of Sir Walter Scott's original 1825 novel that served as the source material for the screenplay. However, Warner Brothers executives made the decision to change the film's title in April of 1954, which meant that the production was already well underway and possibly even completed by the time this marketing shift was implemented. The studio's marketing department apparently concluded that The Talisman sounded too obscure and literary to attract the mass audience they needed to recoup their investment in this expensive CinemaScope production, so they opted for a title that would more directly communicate the film's content and appeal to moviegoers. The new title, King Richard and the Crusaders, was chosen very strategically to capitalize on two elements that Warner Brothers believed would draw audiences into theaters. First, the word Crusaders was considered an exciting buzzword that immediately evoked images of medieval warfare, exotic locations, and the kind of large-scale adventure that people expected from big-budget historical epics. Second, the studio recognized that King Richard himself was a familiar and popular figure who had recently appeared in other successful films, most notably MGM's 1952 hit Ivanhoe, which had earned $7 million at the box office and proven that audiences had a strong appetite for stories set during the time of the Lionheart. By putting Richard's name directly in the title, Warner Brothers hoped to tap into that existing enthusiasm and suggest to potential ticket buyers that this film would offer the same kind of medieval spectacle and adventure that they had enjoyed in those earlier productions.